week preacher last year and has been in the pulpit a couple other times in the past year. She's a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, where she is back there as the director of faculty operations, and also teaches in the philosophy and ethics departments. In between that graduation and homecoming, if you will, to this new position for her, she earned a Master's of Philosophy from Oxford, a Master's of Divinity from General Theological Seminary, and a PhD from Notre Dame in ethics. And if you're familiar with academia, a PhD in ethics and philosophy from Notre Dame is as good as it gets. It's an excellent degree. And I think what is fascinating about Deonna, about the topic that we'll be listening to and learning from her today, is that she does a wonderful job, and you've seen this in her homilies, of keeping her feet in both worlds, academia and the world as it is. And she's currently working on an MSW, is that correct? Master's of
Clinical Mental Health Counseling.
Master's of Clinical Counseling, sorry, not an MSW. So again, like I said, all those degrees and still learning. And so we're excited for what you'll bring for us. Let us pray. Loving and gracious God, we thank you for the beauty of this spring morning, for the changing seasons, and for your consistency in our lives. We thank you for scholars and practitioners, faithful people who love you and love this world, who desire justice, peace, and mercy. May we learn to live into that as your Son, our Savior Christ, has taught us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Patrick. It's always great to be back here. I feel like St. John's is my second home. It was a little dicey this morning. They closed I-25 at Ridgegate, exit 194, because there's a huge accident. So I wasn't sure I was going to get here on time, but I did it. Thankfully, I'm glad I left early. Yeah, I'm sorry Richard couldn't be here. The original topic was supposed to be about the Johnson Amendment, about some of the rules relaxing which churches could then endorse political candidates, which wouldn't violate their 501c3. Just for the record, I don't think that's a good idea. But anyway, we don't get to talk about that. But Richard did want me to just remind you of what we were going to talk about, because that was something obviously he thought you all should discuss as a congregation. But anyway, and also just FYI, I'm actually still canonically resident in the Diocese of Alabama. So Richard is now my bishop. So who knew? There we are, small world. But anyway, so today we did a bit of a pivot, and so we're going to talk about moral injury. Has anybody heard of moral injury? Not many. Okay, but a couple, so that's good. Yeah, just a little backstory about why I ended up sort of turning to this as an area of research. So as you heard in that very generous introduction from Patrick, my specialty is in ethics, but specifically it was the ethics of war. And so I did a lot of studying about the just war tradition, both moral and immoral ways about fighting. And so that was kind of the intellectual aspect of it. But then before I came back to Colorado, I was teaching at Air University. I taught at the Air War College, Air Command and Staff College, and I also supervised some faculty, many of whom were veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And a couple of them had some serious issues that they were dealing with post their time in Iraq and Afghanistan, both spiritual, emotional, physical issues. And it was basically in sort of journeying with them through their return after combat that got me interested in this idea of moral injury. We talked a lot about PTSD, so I'll talk about that a little bit in the talk. But, you know, there's folks who come back from wars that don't have a scratch on them, but they're not themselves when they come back. And what they've done, what they've seen, what they've been exposed to has permanently sort of affected them, and oftentimes in a really difficult way where they're still suffering profoundly from their experiences in war. So that's kind of where I got into this area of sort of intellectual research, and then sort of combined with my pastoral ministry, I was really interested in, well, how do we help people heal? What resources do we have in the Christian tradition that would actually help people heal from what they've experienced? Because the medical community wasn't always very successful at it, and we'll kind of see why as I go through the talk. So that's just a little bit of background there. Okay, so the term moral injury itself is sort of a new term, but the concept is ancient. The person who's given credit for coining the term is Jonathan Shea, who's a physician, and he wrote this book called Achilles in Vietnam, Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. I highly recommend this book. We teach this at the Air Force Academy in our Ethics of War class, and we do some excerpts of it from some of our other classes. But it's been known by many terms throughout history. Shell shock is what we used to call it, probably most notably in the World Wars, but the earliest concept is back in 416 BCE. Right, long time ago, where Euripides coined the term miasma, which was a sense of moral defilement or feeling morally polluted after an experience in war. So, sort of a motivation slide. First of all, the graph at the bottom is inverted. I'm thinking this might be a Doge thing, because this report just got published on March 8th. So I'm just thinking maybe for all the cuts, someone didn't get a cue see it, but it's backwards. The non-veteran adult population is the bottom line, that's almost straight, and then the top line that's increasing, that's the veteran population. So that's from 2001 to 23. And it was this statistic that caught the attention of the Department of Defense. By the way, I should say, this is my own view, does not reflect the views of the Department of War or anything, so there's my disclaimer, I forgot to say at the beginning. So this is all my views. So that trend is very concerning, obviously, because all things considered, people who serve in the military have much higher protective factors against suicide. All things considered. Why? Because you're part of a community, you're part of a job where it's considered a vocation, you feel like you're being part of something higher than yourself, you're with a shared group of people who have similar values, right? And you should be part of a community that reinforces these types of values. So all things considered, being in the military should have a higher protective sense of factors to mitigate against suicide, but we're seeing absolutely the opposite here. So people are wondering, what is going on? This seems very strange. And just another graph for you. So the top is male veterans and the bottom is female veterans, and then the dashed lines are the non-veterans. That symbol is, that code down there is correct. So obviously something was happening, and what we found, I think it was in 2007, we had more military members die by suicide than we had combat deaths. So from the government's point of view, this is something that seriously needs to be investigated. And this is when the idea of moral injury started coming more into currency, in addition to talking about PTSD. So what I want to talk about is sort of what the difference is between PTSD and moral injury, how moral injury happens and sort of how we define it, and then ways for prevention and mitigation, and then ways for healing. I'm going to go through this a bit quick. Normally this is an hour and a half presentation, so I have to truncate it a little bit, but hopefully you'll get a good 30,000 foot view. All right, so quick scenario. That's kind of a setup of a unmanned aerial system operator console. So the folks who fly drones. So that's the pilot position there, and on the right side, you don't see a person there, that would be the sensor operator. So I taught this, I've been teaching this and given this particular lecture, I don't know, about 8 years now. And when I taught it at Air University, a student came up to me after my talk and said, I experienced this because one of my colleagues, because he was a drone operator, and many of our drone operators, I hate to use drones, but it's just quicker than saying unarmed aerial systems. Our drone operators are located at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. That's where our main squadrons are there that do this. And he said, I watched one of my colleagues who I'm absolutely sure had moral injury, and I watched him sort of completely decline. And so what had happened was something went wrong, and his colleague, the captain, accidentally killed American friendly forces. And when something like that happens, you would hope there would be like a big debrief, what happened, who's going to take responsibility, but that actually didn't happen in his squadron. So as you can imagine, the captain felt terrible about it and took the whole weight of responsibility on that mission failure on himself. And his colleague who was telling me the story said he watched him start not showing up for work. On the weekends, he would just lock himself in his room, and he would drink. He would just play video games all day. And some people in the squadron thought, well, maybe he has PTSD. And so they sent him to the medical facility, but he didn't meet the criteria for PTSD. So PTSD is actually like a clinical diagnosis, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And basically, he just was not able to function anymore in his role as a warfighter, and did not have the resources available to him within the squadron, within the mental health community, to help him process and work through that event. And so he ended up separating from the Air Force, and then the captain in my class was telling me that he has no idea what happened to him. So that's sort of like an example, and we'll kind of use this as kind of the case a little bit to walk through some of these concepts. All right, so PTSD and moral injury, sometimes we talk about these things as the same, but they're different. PTSD, I think a shorthand way of thinking about it is the neuroscience of fear, because it has to do with the way our brain and our limbic system responds to threat. So PTSD is actually a clinical diagnosis. It's in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, 5th version. TR means the text revision. And there's a very clear set of criteria that has to be met to meet that diagnostic criteria. So it's very much a medical, clinical diagnosis. But we tend to use it kind of in a comprehensive way. So PTSD is what we now call the comprehensive and holistic war and service wound, known since ancient times, but it's been emptied today of its moral, religious, spiritual, and emotional, and communal dimensions. And we've relegated it to the arenas of the medical, mental health, and criminal justice systems. So moral injury has really sort of stepped in, the concept of moral injury has kind of stepped in to fill that space. But before we move on to moral injury particularly, I just want to walk you through sort of what's going on with the brain with PTSD, and then why moral injury presents very similarly. So the brain, sorry it's a bit of a busy slide, think of PTSD as the fear circuitry in our brain being dysregulated. All right, so there's 3 main areas in the brain associated with PTSD. We have the amygdala, so that's the reptilian ancient part of the brain, right? That's our fight, flight, freeze part of the brain. And then the hippocampus is responsible for memory. And then the medial prefrontal cortex, that front part of our brain, that's the part of the brain that is our executive functioning, and it's also responsible to help regulate emotions. So what happens with an extreme threat response to where we feel our physical life is in danger, right? Our body kicks into survival mode, and it's trying to help us get out of danger. So this is a very simple, you're out in the Sahara and you see a lion and you're like, I'm going to get eaten, right? So the amygdala part of the brain is like, okay, do I run? Do I hide? Do I fight the lion? So you figure out whatever's going to work for you. Obviously, you're going to remember this, because it's a significant emotional event. And then when we're in the fight-flight mode, that reptilian part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex usually shuts down. Okay, so this is why if you're really angry and you're really upset and you're really emotionally activated and that fight, flight, freeze part of your brain is, really pinging, this is why we make bad decisions, right? Why we say things we don't mean and we can't think clearly. Because the body is just trying to preserve and defend itself. And it's only until we can get into a calm or sense of being emotionally regulated is that front part of the brain going to come back on. So when we experience something that is threatening to our own survival, those parts of the neurons, right, in the brain get really deeply grooved and connected. And it kind of miswires the brain a little bit too. So what we get is hyperarousal, right? So your high blood pressure, high heart rate, constantly on alert, right? You can get intrusive memories, right? So because obviously that experience, thinking you might have just died or you witnessed something terrible, you're going to get intrusive memories. And you can get emotional numbing, because with something that significant, the body gets overwhelmed and isn't able to deploy its normal coping mechanisms to be able to deal with the experience. So that's why it leads to sort of dysfunctioning. Now, it's interesting, people can have the same experiences, but some people are able to cope, and they don't have these sorts of symptoms and reactions. And other people can experience the same event, but because of a whole bunch of different factors, they might not be able to cope with the experience in a way. And so the default mode is, this is a lot of pain, this is a lot of suffering, this is completely overwhelming. So what I want to do is engage in activities and take myself out of situations where I'm not going to be reminded of this situation and I'm not going to have to re-experience it. All right, so think of PTSD as the main primary emotions are fear, terror, and horror, right? So this is really about the fear and threat to our physical well-being. All right, so moral injury, there's a lot of different definitions. This one, I think, is one of the better ones. The lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioral, and social impact of, there's a lot of dimensions to this, perpetrating, so we're actually doing something actively, failing to prevent, so that means we had the ability to step in and do something and we didn't, bearing witness to, so maybe we were sort of just watching something, maybe on TV, social media, we saw pictures, we're reviewing something, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So those are a lot of different opportunities to be exposed to events that could transgress our deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And notice the primary emotions here are guilt, shame, and anger. It's important to understand the difference between the fear and horror. Those are emotions that we experience during an event. It's happening simultaneously. Where guilt, shame, and anger, those are emotions that we experience after event. After event. Guilt, shame, and anger, those are reflective emotions. Okay? So, what I tell my students, when we talk about experiencing something that transgresses deeply held moral beliefs, it's important to remember that our warfighters already inhabit a moral world, right? No one comes in blank slate when they come into the military, right, or go fight in a war. They're bringing in a set of values already, So when I get my freshmen in my classes, they already have 18 years, sometimes 19, sometimes longer, right, of moral formation. So they bring that to the Air Force Academy, and then at the Air Force Academy, we work on professional and moral formation, right? Two, that's part of what our job is, and so that they can be professional service members, and they can fight wars according to the laws of war, and they can understand what fighting honorably means and fighting dishonorably, what that means. All right, so here's all the different ways in which moral beliefs and moral communities can be formed. It's not exhaustive, right? So I'm going to start on the right side first. There's narrative sources of moral beliefs and expectations. Our family, that's the first place we learn, right? What's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's evil. What does it mean to be a good person? What are our expectations of us in order to function well in a community? We also get religious formation. So obviously that's a key component of the church, right, is religious formation in the moral and spiritual life. And even folks who don't identify as a Christian or any particular religion, typically people have some sort of spiritual beliefs. They have some sort of moral worldview about what constitutes good and evil, what's right and wrong. And then we also have national narratives too, right, about what we expect from our military and our warfighters. And then, as I mentioned, in the military, we're also inculcating values and a sets of standards and expectations about conduct for our warfighters. So those are some of the ways in which people are formed and how those deeply held moral beliefs, right, get instilled in someone. And on the left side, I have core identity and worldview formation. Now, typically, for healthy, functioning individuals, most of us would say, I'm a good person. That doesn't mean we're perfect, but overall, I would say most of us think that we're generally good people. We make mistakes. Maybe we don't do everything perfectly all the time, but baseline, most of us would say we're generally good people. And how that cashes out is it means I'm capable of moral action, right? I can make good decisions. I can make bad decisions, right? I have moral agency. We also think that the world has a moral meaning and that good and evil matter. So we're not nihilists, hopefully. And that's an important part of someone's worldview. And the third part is my community shares those values, which also cashes out to we hold each other accountable. These are three very key pieces of somebody understanding themselves as a person who has moral agency, who is working and living in a moral domain in which good and evil matter, right? Because that influences our sense of having moral agency. And then we live in a community in which those values are generally shared and reinforced. It's when that left side goes haywire, I'm not a good person, I have no moral agency, the world has no moral meaning, and I'm not part of a community that shares these values. This is where we start to see the slide into moral injury, dysfunction, and when we get to the suicidal and self-harming behaviors. And I'll drill into that a little bit more deeply in a second. Okay, so we've talked about how we have all these sources of moral expectations and our core identity and worldview. The problem is once you're in a war or other situations, potentially, it's not just limited to combat, we can find ourselves in situations that conflict with these moral expectations. Right? So I can all day long in my classroom talk to my students about the ethics of war, what a just war is, why it's important that we fight them that way, why we don't target civilians, why we obey the Geneva Conventions. I can tell them that all day long, but once they get out into a real conflict, They may find themselves very much where they don't feel like they're fighting in a war that's justified, or they're being asked to do things that seem to violate the Geneva Conventions, or they're watching other members do it, or maybe they're watching other countries' war fighters do that. And so this is going to create, right, a conflict between what they've internalized as right and wrong for war fighters, and then what they're actually either experiencing and witnessing, or what they're being asked to do. So this is going to cause dissonance within the individual, and so the body and the brain are going to have to figure out how to resolve that conflict. All right, so potentially morally injurious events. So this is not exhaustive, but just representative. So betrayal, so leadership failures, illegal or immoral orders. Why is that? Because most service members believe and hope that their leaders are going to be good stewards of their lives, right? And aren't going to send them out to do things if it's not justified, right? And they don't have a reasonable chance of being successful in what they're being asked to do. Betrayal by peers, okay? This is a problem, right? Because we talk about, hey, I don't even care about what the war is about. I just want to make sure my buddy in the foxhole is safe. Right? And so the idea of camaraderie, fighting for one another, knowing that you have each other's back, that's a key principle in military understanding of, identity, and a lot of moral motivation to fight too. So when we feel betrayed by our peers as service members, right, that's also very jarring because it violates that sense of communal shared beliefs. Failure to live up to one's own moral standards, right? So oftentimes we think, hey, I'm a moral person. If I'm ever confronted with something that's going to be real difficult, I think I'll have the wherewithal to stand up and resist it. But then we find ourselves in that situation and we find out that we didn't have the moral willpower, or the circumstances were such that we were kind of caught in a catch-22. And no matter what we did, it was going to be a bad outcome, right? That's a terrible dilemma or tragic choices. Disproportionate violence, so mistreatment of enemy combatants and acts of revenge. And so this is a problem for warfighters because we talk about the idea of only fighting combatants, trying to protect non-combatants, trying to protect women and children, trying to protect infrastructure, only targeting military targets. So this is what we're taught sort of in the ethics of warfighting, but as you all know, right, wars don't always unfold so neatly according to a set of rules. And then witnessing atrocities. That's something no one can ever really be prepared for. We talked about incidences involving civilians, excessive collateral damage, and then also within rank violence, so military sexual trauma, friendly fire, and fragging. Obviously, sexual trauma is a problem, especially if it comes from within the ranks, because again, that's somebody who's supposed to be one of your comrades in arms, right, who's taking advantage of your vulnerability and betraying you. And in case for those of you who don't know what fragging is, although I bet some of you in here do, fragging it happened in Vietnam quite often when you had very inept leaders, and sometimes the more seasoned veterans would purposely kill or injure their own leaders because their leadership was so dangerous. So not every traumatic event produces moral injury, and a lot of that has to do with the person's ability to cope with the event. So it's very subjective, and moral injury only arises when an event conflicts with a person's identity. So this is a really key, very, very key point. So we can, and I think it's important to tease this out a little bit. We can objectively say somebody experienced a morally injurious event, right? A discrete event that they could discuss and name and describe. But when we talk about someone experiencing moral injury, when we talk about that in the field, it's more that the person experienced that event and then they were unable to deal with it. So the normal resources and coping mechanisms that they had at their disposal were not sufficient enough to help them process and basically come to grips with that event that they experienced, right? So some people could two people could witness the same event. One person would be able to go, yeah, that was horrible, and they might be affected by it in the short term in a reasonable way, but then be able to recover and move on and continue functioning, like daily normal functioning. Other people might not be able to deploy their coping mechanisms or have the type of resources that they need personally to help them integrate that experience into their overall worldview and sense of themselves. And so they end up sort of continuing to be overwhelmed by the experience, and this is what promotes dysfunctioning. And I mean it in the sense of not being able to function normally. Like the UAS pilot, not being able to sort of come to grips with what happened, and then kind of going on this sort of spiral to the point where he left the Air Force and then no one ever saw him again. Okay, so after you experience something terrible, you're witnessing torture or something terrible has happened in war that you didn't quite expect was going to happen, what does the mind ask about this? So what does perpetrating, experiencing, or witnessing this act say about me? So if I'm the pilot, the UAV pilot, who accidentally ended up killing friendly American forces, what is he saying to himself about who he is? Is he saying, well, that was just a terrible mistake, like all these things went wrong, there was breakdowns in the chain of command from X all the way down to Z, there was no way I was going to be able to make any other different decisions based on all the information that I had? Or is it going to be, oh my God, I just killed American forces, how could I ever wear the uniform again? If people knew what I did, would they ever want to serve with me, right? So this is what, so remember, moral injury is about shame and guilt, right? These are reflective emotions after the event. So it's shame about who I am and what I did, right? Reflective versus just living in that moment of just being terrified. So what does this say about me? And so I use the UAS example, but what does it say that, I was even in an army that would do these types of things? What does it mean about me that I trusted this person? And it turns out like they completely betrayed me and everybody in our unit. I must be completely naive, like what was I thinking, right? So it's this self-reflection about one's identity that's so insidious about moral injury. What does it say about me? What does it say about me that I thought I would be able to have the moral courage to step in and stop something that I knew was wrong? But when I got into the environment, I wasn't able to do it for whatever reason. Right? Or you're like, oh, I would never do that because this is nothing like who I am. And then you get in a really challenging situation and you find yourself doing the very thing that you said you wouldn't do. I mean, it's St. Paul, right? I do the things that I don't want to do, right? And I don't do the things that I want to do. So this is why this sense of character, this is why Jonathan Shea wrote Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character, right? Because it's about how the individual understands their identity and who they are as a person. That moral injury, that's the space moral injury is working in. Okay, so there's two ways, I kind of alluded to this, when we find ourselves in a situation that could be morally injurious. So how do we focus on and interpret the event? So we can be behavior focused. I did something wrong, right? I misread the screen and I misidentified U.S. forces for Afghan forces. So this can lead to guilt, and it's a focus on behavior, right? Okay, so this is what I did wrong. Here's what happened. Here's how we can fix this in the future and identify, okay, here's why, we went from A to Z and here's all the problems in between. And so with guilt, there's a motivation for repair, right? So, okay, we can understand why this happened. I'm working hard to fix it. This was really tragic, but this is something that we can do better in the future, right? And so when we're behavior focused, it can be compatible with a sense of forgiveness, right, and repair. Okay, this was a mess. We figured out what went wrong. Here's where everybody has responsibility. We're not gonna, say that it wasn't wrong or it wasn't tragic, but at least let's identify it and work to be better. But we can also, in the case of the UAS pilot, we can think about the event from an identity-focused frame. It's called attribution theory. And so you can interpret it as, I am something wrong. I'm a bad pilot. I should have never joined the Air Force, right? I'm obviously incompetent if I wasn't able to catch this thing, right? So instead of externalizing the behavior and looking at it objectively to try to figure out how it happened in the context, it's the behavior's internalized. I am somehow fundamentally the problem. So this leads to shame, right? So I did something. I'm still a good person, myself understanding I'm still a good person, but I did something wrong, versus I am something wrong. I'm fundamentally a bad person. And that's what leads to shame. So it's a focus on identity, and it motivates hiding, right? So think about whenever you've experienced shame. You want to hide, right? We talk about hiding our face. It's all in the New Testament, or the Old Testament, Think of Adam and Eve, right? What did they do? They hid, yeah? So when we experience shame, we want to hide. Because there's also a sense of shame has to do with the communal connections, too. We don't want to show our face. So the UAS operator, what did he do? He didn't go to the squadron events. He went home. He locked himself in his apartment. He drank. He played video games. He didn't want to interact with anybody. And when you feel like you are something wrong, you're fundamentally defective, then you don't think you can be forgiven, right? I can't be fixed. I'm permanently broken, and there's nothing anybody can do or say. Right? So this happened because I am permanently a defective person. This is sort of what the person experiencing moral injury is a way they can interpret the event, right? So you can see why someone who's working more on the behavior focus side, it'll be a bit of a process, but you can sort of assess what happened, try to make corrections, and then do better next time. But your sense of your core identity is still intact, right? But when people are moving into, I am fundamentally a bad person, that's much, much harder to help heal and address. All right, so we're talking about attributional qualities. So with the drone pilot, here's how this would kind of cash out. So we talk about internal, stable, and global attributions. And so when these are kind of on the negative side, this is when we run into problems. So an internal attribution, it's my fault. I killed them. These deaths are on me. If I had been more careful, this would not have happened. So an internal attribution, taking responsibility in and of itself, is not necessarily a moral injury, and that actually can be very healthy, right? There's times we do need to say, this is my fault, I messed up, right? And take responsibility. But it's moving down from an internal attribution to a stable attribution to a global attribution is where the spiral happens. So, see how the difference is in the stable attribution. So, a stable attribution is it will always be true. So when it's framed negatively, I'm the kind of person who makes catastrophic mistakes. I can't be trusted with responsibility, ever. This proves I am fundamentally incompetent, always, at all things. Then you go down to 3. Now you have a global attribution, so it defines who I am as a person. I am a terrible officer. I'm not worthy to wear the uniform. I'm not the kind of person who deserves to lead. Everything I thought about myself was wrong. So when a person mentally is sort of going through that movement, this is where we end up with the problems of the symptoms and the physiological responses from moral injury. So to sum it all up, the UAS operator might have been thinking, those men died because of me. This proves I am the kind of person who destroys the people I'm supposed to protect. I should never have been trusted with that responsibility. Very, very different self-orientation internally to that was a completely screwed up mission. What went wrong? How do we fix it? And let's make sure we do better next time, right? So here's just a visual of how the spiral will go. So there's a moral transgression. There's a condemnation of one's identity, which leads to shame. The shame leads to withdrawal. Then the withdrawal leads to complete self-condemnation, and then demoralization, no hope, and then you get into self-harm, right? Now, much of the self-harm has to do with just trying to numb out, right? Because the pain of the shame, your sense of not feeling like you have any hope. So think about a young captain who is a promising pilot, right? Who's working as a UAS operator, doing part of a mission that he thought was important, and then this happens, and that all of that just goes out the window. And so now if his identity was really wrapped up in his sense of self as a military officer, he wanted to have a career as a pilot. Now, maybe after that event, now he doesn't see a future for himself, and he doesn't know how he can live with that act that he accidentally killed American-friendly forces. And so if you don't see a future for yourself, you think you're fundamentally unrepairable, and that your community is going to reject you because of what you did, why would you want to stay alive, right? And so we lead to sort of drugs, alcohol, numbing, addictive processes, self-harm, etc. So tragic action becomes condemned identity, and the person feels they no longer belong to their moral community. Okay, now here's a really interesting thing. Now, I had a slide in here, but I see I took it out and I moved it to an extra slides. But PTSD and moral injury present with the same symptoms, very similar symptoms: hyperarousal, intrusive memories, etc. So sometimes there's people with PTSD and not moral injury. There's people who have moral injury and not PTSD, and there's people who have both. But it's very hard to tease them out because the symptoms present very similarly. Even though, as you can see, the emotional content of PTSD, moral injury are different. So why is it that the body is presenting with symptoms for moral injury like it does with PTSD? Remember, PTSD is that fear, horror, threat to survival problem, right? Okay. This is really interesting. Our body responds to moral transgression often as a threat to our survival. This is really fascinating, okay? Now, why? So we're social creatures. We live in communities and groups. And historically, a loss of belonging historically was a threat to our survival, right? We belonged to tribes and groups. And that was the main source of our being able to eat, our sense of protection. And so it's not unusual. So what was one of the main punishments back, in the ancient times? It was exile. right? It was removing you from your community. Second, moral identity is central to the self. We generally believe we're honorable, we want to protect others, and we have moral agency. And so when these beliefs collapse, our sense of identities is threatened. Who am I? Where do I belong? I'm not the person I thought I was. Where is my place in the world? Meaning frameworks are destabilized. Who am I? Is the world good or evil? Should I just be a nihilist? And can I now belong in a moral community? So for our UAS pilot, you can see why, if his identity as a warfighter was so central to his self-understanding, and he joined the military because he wanted to support and defend the Constitution, protect the ideals of the United States, right? Fight alongside fellow service members, be a good force in the world, right? All motivations why people join and stay in the military. And all of that gets undone. He's lost his community. He doesn't feel he's ever going to be welcomed back again. He doesn't have a sense of who he is going forward. And so all he can see is projecting into the future is there's no place for me. And I have to live with this horrible thing for the rest of my life. So if moral injury, the body and the brain is experiencing that as a threat to survival, right, you're going to be hyper aroused, right? Intrusive memories, numbing, all of those sorts of things. And that's what we see with people with extreme moral injury, which is how we see people with PTSD presenting too. So I think this is really important. And I think this is a really new, development in the field of neuroscience and physiology and how we understand trauma, that it's not just experiencing a physical trauma, but it's the moral weight of the trauma that we experience that's also affecting the body. And I think as an ethicist, and I think the way I was taught ethics, how I teach ethics, how we make judgments about people who engage in some sort of moral transgression, that we really need to take a step back and sort of think about some of the neuroscience and the physiological ramifications of moral transgression, our moral actions, understanding why people act out, as it were, after experiencing significant events, moral transgressions, in any of those ways, whether they did it, whether they failed to present something, whether they witnessed something. So I think it just opens up a sense of being able to drop down a little bit, a sense of sometimes we can be very righteous about seeing people do things and trying to understand why, what's going on with this. One of my friends who's a PhD therapist who works a lot with combat veterans, shared a story where a guy coming back, he and his wife are in couples counseling, and he was engaging in a lot of affairs, and he didn't want to be intimate with his wife and couldn't figure out what was going on. And it turns out told his wife, he's like, I can't bear the person who I am coming back, and I didn't want to pollute you. Right? So if you think about, if we're not thinking about moral behavior in these sorts of terms, you could be, well, you've lost his mind, you're just committing adultery, and you're having all these affairs, what's wrong with you? You're a corrupt person, and you don't want to be intimate with your wife. What's going on? But what was the reason is a sense of shame, right? The sense of who he was coming back, and he loved his wife so much, he didn't want to pollute her, that's what he felt like he was doing. So threats to moral self can activate the brain stress systems almost as strongly as a threat to physical survival. This is really, really important. This is a busy slide, but that's kind of the spiral I showed you from top to bottom. This is it on the right side. So you go from the transgression, there's a dissonance, can't make sense of this, my internal stable global attributions all get framed in a negative way. I feel shame, I withdraw, I can't forgive myself, and then we move into chronic intrusions, avoidance, numbing, self-harm, and you could end up with someone dying by suicide if you're not able to intervene at some point. That's kind of moral transgression to why someone might die by suicide. All right, steps for healing. All right, so I mentioned, here's my slide. On the left side, fear. See in the blue in the middle, the symptoms are re-experiencing avoidance, cognitive mood changes, and physiological arousal. Fear, and then moral injury on the far right side. See how they both say yes? So that's your physiological response from both fear and moral injury. But look at the bottom. So what's lost on PTSD? It's safety, right? Because it's that threat to survival. And what's needed is to regain safety. Those are a little bit more concrete ways of kind of helping someone feel safe to heal. But look at moral injury. What's lost? Trust. And what's needed? Forgiveness. Very, very, very different ways of helping someone recover from the events. This is why I think the church has a lot of room to be helpful here. If we don't make it worse by just being condemnatory of people who are acting out, right, and are not acting in ways that are consistent with their own best self, right? So if we're just judging people and condemning them, it's like, oh, you're bad, like what's wrong with you? This isn't helpful, right? But if we can work on the why is this happening, what's going on, what trust has been violated, how do we help you heal, how is forgiveness restored, without that first line of judgment being condemning, then I think we'll be a little bit more successful. Okay, what's my favorite slide? So this is why just medicating people is not helpful. So when we talk about moral injury, there's 6 areas of moral repair. First, emotional repertoire. How do we help someone deal with shame, guilt, anger at themselves, anger at whoever betrayed them, anger at the system, anger at the government, anger at whatever could be, right? How do they deal with their sense of self-contempt, loss of joy, loss of honor? No medication is going to help with that, right? Relationships. How do we help? Loss of trust, severed ties with the community, feeling disconnected, feeling contaminated, and feeling unforgivable. Where does a person find communities that help restore that? No medication can help that. Self-concept, I'm no good, I can't be trusted, I'm a failure, I'm hopeless. No medication can help that. That can only be done in community, right? And helping someone heal. Concept of the world, there's no God, there's no goodness, life has no meaning, life has no purpose. How do we help someone heal from that? Medication doesn't help that either. Authority over oneself. Inability to calm down, loss of self-control, impulsivity, outbursts, unresponsiveness. Medication can help with that, right? But the problem has been is, especially when we didn't have a good sense of the difference between PTSD and moral injury, what are we seeing? We're seeing people like hyped up, hypervigilant, constantly aroused, high heart rate, right? So what are we giving them? Anti-anxiety medications, right? Now, what's if people had the opposite reaction and they're in like the hypoarousal stage? They feel numb, lack of energy, don't want to do anything. They feel kind of hopeless. What do we give them? Antidepressants, right? But none of those things in and of themselves is going to help somebody heal, right? The goal of medication is to stabilize somebody so they can emotionally regulate, right, into, call it a window of tolerance, so that they have the physiological and cognitive stability to be able to do that hard work of repair in these other areas. Right? If somebody is just hyper anxious, because remember when I talked about the brain is in that hyper threat orientation all the time, the prefrontal cortex is shut off and you can't think clearly. when you're just either constantly hyper aroused in that hyper anxious state because you're in threat detection all the time, and you can't think clearly if you're hypo aroused and you're constantly feeling emotionally numb, you have no energy. You're not going to think clearly, right? So we can use medications to help people bring them into a more sort of regulated state, window of tolerance, so we can get the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex back online, right, to help them be able to process and integrate their experiences, right, in a way, in a community with trusted members of the community that can help the person process and think through and heal from whatever that experience was. So here's some long-term dimensions of recovery. So writing out personal narratives, what happened, so that they can actually honestly write what actually happened, not what they think people want them to say or what they think is more socially acceptable to hear, but that it can be absolutely truthful, so that the truth of their experiences is heard. And often this can be done well writing it out, right, instead of having to necessarily share it in a group, depending on how receptive the group might be to hearing what they have to say. And externalizing the internal struggle and telling the story to others, right? So it's getting out of, no one would love me, no one will think I'm a good person if they actually heard what I had to say, right? So that being able to take it internally and putting it into the community, but then the community hearing it with compassion and without judgment, and letting the person speak what happened to them truthfully, that will help the person kind of get out of the identity attribute sort of aspect of interpreting the event more to the behavioral side, and you can kind of look at it more objectively. Veteran support systems are super helpful, finding community, reconnection with estranged others, rehumanizing of enemies, companions for support and conversation, integrating memory or storing into larger picture, and long-term accountability community. So there's an interesting, I forget who the person who's leading it, but there's an organization that takes Vietnam combat veterans back to Vietnam, and they're taking them back to the villages that they might have bombed or assaulted or killed people, for them to reconnect with the descendants of those people, and then also contribute in building projects, right? So as a way to sort of reconnect with the truth of their experiences when they were warfighters, but sort of now go back to it in a way of reconnecting with their actions and connecting to that community, and often experiencing forgiveness and understanding from those communities. Spiritual resources, worship and ritual, this matters. So there was, did you know in the Middle Ages, there was actually a form of penance for those who came back from the Crusades and war fighting. They did like 40 days of fasting and penance, were not allowed to take communion. And then there was a formal welcoming back of soldiers into the community. But we might think, well, that's terrible. You excommunicated them for 40 days, like how mean? But actually, it was a way for the community to acknowledge that the service members actually witnessed and experienced some pretty challenging things. It gave them space to sort of reflect and process on those experiences. And then by welcoming them back into the community after a specific period of time, there was closure on that experience, and then it allowed them to move back into the community, right? And it was the community acknowledging, we understand war is difficult. You saw a lot of things. Here's some time for reflection, repentance, confession. But we're not going to let you wallow in that forever and ever and ever. Here's a discrete time frame, and you're welcome back into the community. You can take communion again, and now you're reintegrated, right? So what we might think is like judgmental and harsh and mean actually served a therapeutic and healing function that was actually more accurate with respect to understanding what the warfighters experienced and how the community could play a proper role in helping them reintegrate. So, you know, folks that experience moral injury, reconnecting with the community is really important. Even if it's not a church community, it has to be a community of folks who understand what they've gone through and can help them heal without judgment and give them that space, but let them know it doesn't matter what you did, you're still a member of our community. Here's just some resources for you. There's a lot of literature out there. Just Google moral injury on Amazon. You'll see a lot. But like adaptive disclosure is more about the neuroscience, cognitive aspect of moral injury. There's a workbook people who've experienced can kind of work through. What have we done? That's really good. That's more the political aspect of like how we're responsible as a nation for asking our warfighters to engage in like 6 and 7 and 8 deployments in a war that went for 20 years. In Iraq and Afghanistan, soul repair, that has more to do with the spiritual aspect of healing. The chaplains now have a book called Moral Injury for Them, and the one on the right side is also, looks at moral injury also for first responders, because this happens with first responders as well. But the final thought is, warfighters are trained to take responsibility for their actions, true. But no human being should be reduced to the worst thing that they have done. And that's what moral injury does. The person reduces themselves and their whole self-concept to the very worst thing that they've ever done. And part of helping them heal is helping them see that they're a person that's much bigger than the whole is way bigger than the sum of the parts. And that one incident does not define them as a human. It doesn't define them for it, that totalize their sense of worth. And this is where I think the Christian tradition, we have a tremendous amount of resources as the church to help people heal and to listen and to be compassionate, because we can still hold people accountable and name the wrong, right, without rationalizing it or saying, oh, it's not wrong, because that's not helpful. The worst thing you can say to a service member is, in some ways, thank you for your service. Because like, oh, you're thanking me for having killed, all these children at this checkpoint, or you're thanking me for having to have done all these terrible things, right? I know it's well meant, but sometimes it doesn't land well with the service member. Right? So anyway, I raced through that. I think church is in 10 minutes. But happy to talk further. Yeah, so thank you. Sorry we didn't have time for questions. Thank you for using subtitles. Thank you.
So I wonder, in post-World War II Germany, I mean, so many people had done so many terrible things, and, the concentration camps, and, were people so hardened or just denying everything, or was there, has anybody ever looked at, were people able to come back to a better life after that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I haven't done research on that particular population, but the problem with that is that was normalized, right? So the national viewpoint was that Jews were subhuman and they needed to be eradicated, right? So part of the problem is the national narrative was enjoining, this is how you are a good member of the Nazi regime, right? Is you are doing this, versus being trained up to follow a set of rules and then seeing the tragic aspects of it. So, that's why propaganda, sort of brainwashing, all of those sorts of things are done, right? Because the people who are going to suffer the most from moral injury are the people who are the most conscientious, right? And the people who have really strong sets of values. So if you train up a whole cadre to not care, then they're not going to experience that sense of dissonance, because they're going to go, well, this is what it means to be a good soldier, is to be the most efficient at exterminating the Jews, right? So it's going to depend on the individual person. So that's why I said one person could experience it one way and another experience, and it could be different. But that's a really good question. Yeah, no, you're welcome.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm one of those people that says thank you for serving. What should I say? Or should I not bring it up?
Well, I guess, why do you say it? I guess that's a question.
I appreciate them doing something for our country. And my husband's a veteran.
Yeah. Yeah, you like welcome home, or are you getting the support you need
Okay.
as a member of our armed forces? Then that might be a good one thing to say. Yeah.
What about wounded warriors? Like that's,
Yeah.
Is that one of the communities that
Yes.
you advocate?
Yes, but Wounded Warriors, I think, still focus a little bit more on the physical aspects because it's folks who've actually lost limbs and all of those things. I don't know if how much the Wounded Warriors talk about the moral injury side. I bet it probably happens maybe more indirectly. But that is a helpful community, like so people.
Another
Well, like the VA and the chaplains now are like much more educated on this. Like I said, there's the chaplains now have a handbook. They teach a whole section of it now at the chaplains college, so that's helpful. So now that we have the name for it, the helping agencies are more. They can use the name, they understand it, and so they can bring it up with people a little bit
I
better.
was thinking more from our donor advised, but wounded warriors is what we always give to.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good one. I don't know if I'd have to look.
Okay. I just thought.
Yeah, Bright Divinity School. So the woman who wrote Soul Repair was like the first person to like really bring this out into public awareness, and so they might have an agency. I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks for thinking about that, though.
You may recall Scott Barker
Yeah.
in 1970. We
Yeah.
have one other connection. I spent my 6th grade year in Montgomery, Alabama. My dad went to the command and staff.
All right. Yeah.
It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And, I mean, that's the kind of work that needs to be done. And I hope you're getting a lot of play on this in the service. So,
Yeah.
thank you for what you're doing.
All right. No, I appreciate that. Different than like going out and killing people and then saying thank you for your service. But I just gave this lecture to cadets couple weeks ago.
What kind of reactions did you get from them?
Pretty thoughtful.
Oh, good.
Yeah, because they're still so young. They're still idealistic. They haven't
Right.
seen a lot of stuff yet, unless they're prior enlisted.
Yeah.
So it does give them pause. I try to be careful about some of the stories I share with them,
Yeah.
but like that one, I think the UAV operator they kind of get.
They can relate to that.
Yeah. So, but it's helpful, and I think now